Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTed.com video, I'm going to be talking and showing you how to overclock a Nvidia GTX 600 range card. Now, these are very different to overclock from previous generation. For example, the GTX 400 series. There's the boost clock, power targets, and a few other bits and pieces that you have to concern yourself with. Now, this is probably going to be a two-part video because I have a feeling it's going to be fairly lengthy. In this video, we're going to be talking about the basics more than anything, rather than jumping straight into it. Now, you're going to need a few tools before you can do anything. The first of which would be, I would recommend EVA Precision. It's completely free. There are two ways to get it. One, you can just Google it and go onto their website, and then you can just download it from there. The second option would be a little bit, well, easier in that you don't have to register, unlike their official website, and that is you could download it off some kind of download website, which is the method I used, and you know, it's completely legal and all of that. I would also recommend you get GPU Z, and that's from Tech Power Up, and this gives you information about your device, as you can see right here. And you can also do things such as validations and various other bits and bobs if you wish. Obviously, you're going to already need the drivers installed. That kind of goes without saying. And obviously, make sure your card is stable and working and all the other good stuff before you kind of have to worry about the overclocking. So in other words, don't just overclock straight off the bat. If you've just bought the card, do make sure that that card works fine, because otherwise you won't be able to tell if it's because of the overclocking or not. Okay? Right. Fairly simple. So once you've installed these items, before you do anything, before you do any overclocking whatsoever, there are a few things you must know. First of all, overclocking can theoretically damage your card, so I absolve myself of any responsibility. It's not my fault if your PC explodes. I just want to throw that out there. It's very unlikely, but you know, I just like to cover my bases. And additionally, you will need to make sure that your power supply is more than up to the task, especially if the rest of your PC is fairly overclocked anyway. For example, your CPU. Generally speaking, when you start to overclock, obviously that component is going to start drawing more power. This is especially true if you happen to have, say, SLI as well, which I won't really be covering in this video. Then there is other things as well. Now, we're going to talk about the cooling and so on first. I know this is going to sound more boring, but there's actually a very good reason behind it. When you actually overclock these cards, you'll notice what is known as boost clock, okay, right there. And it basically works on this card that the regular core isn't really what we concern ourselves with, as you can see here. The boost is what it's really at. And if you were to, let me just do a very quick example of this. Let me just quickly overclock this very slightly. It's very subtle. And then if I was to, you notice that number there. If I was to quickly go back, you can see that that number has slightly increased. Okay, that's the default clock. That's currently what the card will boost to a minimum. So this is the minimal amount. Now, bear in mind, a lot of this is to do with temperature as well as the power target. Now, we're going to go heavily into that in a moment, but certainly not so much in the early part of this video, because it's very important to recognize about temperatures. Now, when I talk about temperatures, it really comes down to a couple of things. The first is airflow. Airflow in your case is very important. I've already mentioned this in previous videos, but I'll just quickly go over it here. You'll really want to have at least a couple of fans pulling air into the case, preferably from the front, and a couple of fans pulling air out of the case, preferably at the back. Do not mix and match. In other words, do not have, say, a couple of fans at the front pulling air in, while another one at the front brings air out. And similarly, the reverse is also true at the back. Why? Because it starts to mix, really mix airflow up. Think of it like this way. Imagine this is your case. Okay, it's a completely crappy example, but imagine this is the case, and this is the front of the case. You want air moving this way. So basically to the back of it, okay? Fairly simple to achieve. Noise is maybe a concern for you. If it is a concern, then you'll want to make sure that those fans are silent and stealth and so on. Remember as well, as I was saying about the power supply, you'll definitely want to make sure that your power supply is more than up to the task. So don't make sure that you're not just kind of sitting on the fence with the power requirements, because if you are, there is a chance that your card could overclock. Could maybe not get the juice it requires and therefore could crash and so forth. So all of that is fairly simple to understand. I think anyway you'll agree. Now, previous generations of cards have been fairly easy to understand. I'll quickly go over it. Basically, on most of the previous generations of cards, you could adjust voltages, although not on all of the cards by any means, and you would simply have one clock speed that you could increase for the memory and one for the GPU, which would also increase the shader core. And it was a simple case of you would find what would work best for your card, and that would be it. So now it's not like that. The good news is cards from the GTX 600 range, at least any of them that will boost, so for example the 670, 680 and so forth, will be absolutely fine and will automatically boost themselves, which is effectively a slight overclock. Now, generally speaking, most websites, when you buy the card, will list what speed that card will boost to. For example, you can see right here that I'm just going to actually default. Actually, no, I'll keep it like it is for a moment. You can see right here that the default clock speed is 1006 megahertz. That's actually above a reference. I have the EVGA for the Win edition, which actually has a higher clock speed. By the way, this EVGA precision does work with any GTX 600 range card, so you don't need to worry about that. It doesn't have to be specific. So, as I was saying, the default clock speed is this. However, in 3D applications, when your system is being, well, taxed, it will automatically boost. Now, boosting is simply the act of the GPU will speed itself up as long as it's within both the power targets you've set, along with the heat. Now that's very important, because what starts happening is your GPU will literally start throttling itself. And by throttling itself, I mean that it will start to lower the boost. Now, from what I understand, the boost clock on this card is very heavily depending upon heat and so forth. So in other words, if your case is fairly cool, you're going to get much better boosting than if your case is very hot and it doesn't have very good power, doesn't have very stable power and everything else. So that's just very important. Now, one thing we will be showing later on is about the fan curves, which you can actually, it's probably going slightly out, but we'll say that later. You can see I've just set a very basic fan curve there just to show you how kind of in-depth you can go. You can by all means make that even more kind of stepped if you want. That's a very crappy example. We will do something a bit better, possibly in a different video. It depends on the length of this one, because I don't have that much time on this particular video. So don't, on this on the general options, do not start with Windows at the start. Now, before we go into the actual settings and so on, I want to tell you the basics of overclocking. There are a few things that you will need to know. The first is, do not just throw the GPU clocks and the CPU clocks up to their, ridiculously highest settings at the start. Why? Because you're going to just get instability. Generally speaking, you'll want to nudge it like 13 to maybe 25 megahertz at a time. Really depends on how much patience you've got. At the first initial stage, you can probably move it to 25 to 50. But certainly don't go to like 150, don't don't do one of these numbers where you're throwing all the way to that, because that's just not sensible at all. So what I'd recommend is that you're fairly sensible with the initial settings, and you're also going to need a series of applications to test this. Now there are a couple of options. Personally, however, I prefer games. Some people prefer Thermark, some people prefer Heaven Bench. I really like just running a game. There's quite a few of them available in terms of free benchmarks if you don't happen to have one. A game that actually supports it. For example, Resident Evil 6 has a free benchmark available, or you could even download, say, Batman Arkham City or something like that has, of course, benchmarks in it. Tomb Raider, if you happen to own that has a really nice benchmark as well. And these are just very good. Or you could simply game for a while. And this is very important because you'll need to also take measurements of temperature as well as everything else that you'll need. So yeah, now monitoring wise, you're going to want to monitor all of this stuff. In particular, you'll want to monitor GPU voltage as well as GPU temperature. You can indeed decide to take logs of this if you want, which could well be a good idea. In fact, you can actually add this as an on-screen display. And that's actually a very nice idea if you're gaming and you want to see constant readouts of the temperatures at the start. By the way, you can also do some really nice stuff on this, like screen capture, which is pretty cool, as well as set various profiles, as well as user interfaces. To be honest, this is fairly ugly. By the way, there are other applications, such as, for example, Afterburner. You don't want to be using Afterburner and say this at the same time. You will have some problems later on. So what I personally would recommend as a very, very quick and dirty test is to go ahead and try to figure out the rough maximum speed that your system can do. Now, a very basic idea, just to kind of give you an idea, is you can quite happily turn auto off, turn your fan to 100%, increase the power target to all the way to 145%, it won't break your card or anything like that. Then you could, for example, increase this to, like, I don't know, say for example 50 or 60 megahertz, do the same for memory, apply it, test the game, and so forth. Be warned, there is also voltage tweaks. Now you're absolutely fine to put it all the way up to the max, but remember, this is going to start adding, shall I say, more heat to the card. And you don't want to just add tons of heat unless absolutely necessary. Now, like all overclocking, there is going to become a point where you're either going to reach a maximum, in other words, where it simply won't go anymore without either crashing or locking up or what have you. For example, the display driver might need to restart. You might have that message, or the game might freeze up completely. Or you might even get Windows freezing or your PC freezing. Don't worry if it does. It's 99.9% chance nothing's broken. You will just have to restart your PC if your PC freezes, or you'll just have to quit the application, what have you, depending upon the circumstances. Generally speaking, it's absolutely fine. So there is, however, going to be a point where you'll have to decide, is a few extra megahertz worth the extra fan speeds or whatever. Some people absolutely dislike noise, other people are more tolerant towards it. So fan curves and so on are also extremely important in regards to this, because obviously you have to kind of decide what temperatures your fan is going to start kicking in, and therefore it really depends upon your noise tolerance. Also, another point, not all cards work the same. In other words, you can have exactly the same brand of your friend, you could even buy it from exactly the same store, but your core could just be of a worse quality. But on the other hand, your memory could be of, say, a better quality. So, for example, you might be able to get a memory core offset of, say, let's say that, but your friend might be able to get a clock offset of, in terms of the GPU, of, say, that, but you can only get it to say that, but he can only get his memory to say that. In other words, there is no real, yeah, these settings will definitely work. I'm still really tweaking mine at the moment, if I'm honest with you, but definitely GPU, my personal GPU boost can easily go to 1250, which is quite nice. That's well above what the manufacturers put as the default. Now, as I was saying with default clocks, if you do nothing, if you do not put an offset there, the core will automatically boost to a minimum of this speed. But providing the temperatures are okay, and providing the card is within the power range, the power target, if you will, it says, hey, you know what, we're cool, we can actually increase the clock speed more. And so if you were to have a second monitor and drag this application to the second monitor, as well as whatever else, this does have a live readout, I believe, you will be able to see your GPU clock start increasing and going up and down the boost clock, shall I say. And of course, you'll also see the temperature raise and fall as well. Now, I know this is a lot, and I know many of you are just itching just to overclock your GPU, and I understand that. Now, there are a few methods really to doing this, and it really depends on how much effort and how much time you want to put into it. In this video, I'm going to tell you how to do the very basics. And by very basics, I mean you will have a somewhat reasonable overclock, but it will by no means be the maximum that you will be able to achieve, and it will by no means be as cool or as silent as what you will be able to achieve. I will be doing a second video for that, because otherwise a lot of the video would just be taken up with the basics, and I don't want to make like an hour or a 35-minute long video for people who just want the basics, and similarly those who want more advanced advice, I don't want them to have to skip tons either. So anyway, as I was saying, what I would recommend you do first of all is to try and get an idea of what the maximum is on your card. How I'd recommend you do that is just simply click on a voltage and tweaks, max this out, max the power target out, and then basically turn this from auto, and then you can just increase the slider. I won't, because otherwise it will start making lots of noise, and I don't want to do that, because otherwise it will interfere with audio quality. And then you will simply start to nudge these up. Okay, this will give you a very basic overclock. Once you apply it, for example, this will easily work on my card, so I'm just going to quickly apply that. You'll notice that it does actually increase for a second, and then we'll skip down. Obviously, I'm on desktop with no 3D applications really running, so don't worry about that. Now, if you guys take a look there, you can see that that has indeed updated. If I was to default that real quick and then kind of go backwards, it does indeed kind of catch up. So as I was saying, I would recommend for the first hurdle, maybe increasing it to about 50 to 60. You can actually nudge it if you really want to be, OCD over it with arrow keys. Just saying, if you are one of those people that have to have even numbers or what have you. So as I was saying, I would personally recommend increasing the GPU first. Do not put both on the line. I would personally recommend, if you are going to increase both, put no more than like this on both. That's probably a good starting point, actually, and then you can just increase one. I personally speaking would increase the GPU, because if you start increasing both, you're going to hit a wall with one of them eventually. So for example, if you're increasing both, you might be able to only get the memory to 75 megahertz, but the core might be good to go to another like 150. But you don't know which one has caused the crash. So in other words, you still have to do the work. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's best just to start with very basic overclock, like 25 to 50 to both, and then you can start to increase just the GPU clock. Then after you've got a basic understanding of what that maximum is, you can go ahead and reset that to a very sensible number, for example a GPU boost of say 50, and then start to increase the memory offset. Why do you want to do it that way? Because that way you definitely know that heat isn't the issue for the memory. So for example, let's say the core on this was just about operating within tolerance levels because of the power, because of general stability, heat, voltage, and so on. Well, if you were to then increase that as well, you don't know what the maximum of that is, because it could have crashed because you're starting to push the thermal threshold, or it could start throttling because of that as well. We'll go into that in a second. You want to keep the fan, as I said, at 100%, so you definitely won't need to worry about thermal throttling so much. Generally speaking, on these cards, they are not one of those examples where bandwidth or GPU clocks are a problem. In other words, one of them is more important than the other. For example, on some cards, the memory clock or memory bandwidth effectively is not enough. In other words, there's not enough memory bandwidth for in some rarer cases. There's actually tons of memory bandwidth spare, and the GPU isn't actually able to saturate the memory bus anyway. So in some cases, on some cards, you can actually overclock the memory, and the GPU core doesn't really make that much of a difference. In other cases, it's the reverse. In this case, on the GTX 670, in my case, they are very much kind of even in importance. So you do want to try and get a good balance. Another point I will quickly make is that the GTX 670, once overclocked, can easily outperform the GTX 680 and other cards in that price range. So for example, the 7970 and so on as well. This makes it a very, very good purchase in my personal opinion, and the reason I went for this card even over the GTX 680, it was because of its overclocking potential. Now, there isn't that much more to say on this particular video. I know it's very basic, but you guys have a very basic understanding now of how to overclock. Do not start or apply this when Windows starts, just to make sure if you do have a crash. Worst crash that I've ever had on a card like this, I had to actually reinstall the drivers, but it was like really minuscule problem. Obviously it didn't take that much effort. You might have the odd blue screen or what have you. As I've said, worst comes to worst, you'll have to just hard reset your PC. Absolutely nothing to worry about. The most important thing on this is you do need to make sure that your case has very, very good airflow. I really cannot stress that enough, and that you've got good voltage requirements. As I've said previously as well, do make sure that your card, generally speaking, is performing well. In other words, there are no crashes, there are no bugs, there are no random kind of frame rate skips or just issues with the card, because obviously then overclocking you won't be able to see if it's stable whatsoever. It's just going to be completely awful. So yeah, as I was saying, very, very, very basic overclock. Simply set the fan all the way to 100%, and then start increasing the boost. In the next video, we're actually going to be doing this properly, and by which I mean we are going to spend a lot more time on this and to actually give a good, solid performance with a decent fan curve. So I'm going to be showing you how to set the fan curves, how to adjust, and what benchmarks and so on to run, and how to really test it. But I just wanted to throw it out there right now because some people weren't really sure what GPU boost was, so I just wanted to explain that, and I just wanted to explain what power targets are and the importance of keeping your card cool. So consider this part one. There will be a follow-up in the next few days, I promise you. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I know it's fairly brief, especially for me, but I didn't want too much in this particular lesson because I wanted this to be just kind of an introduction to what is overclocking, how do you go about it. And the next one, we will be going heavily into how do you tweak it best for your system, as well as general practices, and ways to keep your card cool, fan profiles, and everything else that you're going to need. But for the very basics, all you need to do is set a power target, and then start to increase the GPU boost. Remember, as I've said earlier, the boost is the minimal speed it will actually accelerate to. So anyway, as I was saying, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon for the second part, which is going to go into a lot more detail. Take care and bye for now.